Hello, welcome to BCM241 Media Ethnographies. This week we are talking content generation. In this video, I will take you through the content generation process for a digital artifact and prepare for next week when we will start to repurpose the content that we create this week and spread it across multiple different platforms. So also remember this week you will be creating content for your media niche and then posting about that experience on your blog. So you'll be working on your digital artifact and your blog post this week. Okay, we are going to use the ethnographic and qualitative research skills that we introduced earlier in the subject to structure our approach to preparing and generating content for our niche. Remember that the term ethnography in the context of media and communication means applying qualitative methods that explore the diverse ways of different people and different cultures, the way they exist and the way they interact. By employing these skills in creating media, we develop a deeper understanding of audience behaviors, values, and perspectives, which then informs the creation of engaging, relevant, and impactful content. Qualitative research means collecting non-numerical data to help us understand the audience's perceptions, interpretations, and experiences. Remember, you are part of the audience you are creating media content for. So your experience matters. Qualitative research includes interviews, focus groups, surveys, and textual analysis, among other methods. The important thing is that you are critically reflecting on our own experiences. This method is what we call autoethnography, and that's the key method that we're using in this subject. In this video, we are going to be focusing on the ethnographic and qualitative research skills of perspective, problematizing, approaching, and conceptualizing. In the next video on content generation, we will look at contextualizing, mapping, narrowing, and exploring. And then finally in this series, we will look at including, comparing, contrasting, and the collective skills in reflexivity, particularly sensitivity and flexibility. Let's start with perspective. Applying the qualitative research skill of perspective to generating media involves understanding and appreciating different viewpoints, backgrounds, and the experiences of diverse audiences and stakeholders. Let's start with our own perspective as a participant in the media niche. And here's where we can talk about being self-conscious as content creators. Often having a personal interest in a niche means that many of those around us don't share that interest. Growing up, for me, my experience was that fandoms were seen as something that were extremely nerdy and you didn't talk about with other people, family. And it wasn't until even in the late 1990s, early 2000s, that the idea of fandom became really mainstream and celebrated. And that's because the mainstream media industries realized it was very profitable. My media niche that I'm creating content for, the digital artifact for this subject that I'm producing, is super niche. It's the miniatures hobby. For my digital artifact and my media content that I'll be generating for this subject, I'll focus on the competitive tabletop board game Warhammer Age of Sigmar. This is where you build, paint, and play with miniature figures in a competitive setting. My wife and I, we play competitive Warhammer events in Sydney and around Australia. And so I will be creating content for people interested in that experience. And please note how specific this niche is. We'll talk more about that in a second. The point is that this is a vibrant media niche. There is already a very active community of podcasters, streamers, influencers, critics, and fans all producing media. And so part of the process of learning how to create content is developing our perspective and stepping outside of our sphere of comfort, right? It's overcoming reluctance, it's overcoming cringe, it's overcoming anxiety, and it's about sharing something that we have a deep personal interest in and sharing that with others. Part of the skill of perspective is overcoming our familiarity. Right? We're not only talking to people who are inside the niche, we want to bring others in. So we have to challenge our assumptions and the personal bias that we have about our media niche. For example, the miniatures hobby has historically been quite male dominated. Now, this has changed over the last few years, particularly through COVID, when we saw more and more women get involved in painting miniatures and sharing that experience via Instagram, because we were largely indoors and people were taking up new hobbies. I also recently discovered a brand new YouTube channel for competitive Warhammer players in the Philippines. So we're seeing new markets and areas of interest develop in this media niche, which is really exciting. So that's expanding my perspective, and I want to be part of that change. Part of expanding our perspective is doing audience research. Digging deeper into this media niche, I came across this survey. This is an audience survey from the website Goonhammer, and it provides some really valuable audience research. And quite a large number of people in the media niche participated in this survey back in 2022. And they report that there were between 3.5 and 5 million active consumers of Warhammer. My potential audience that we can see from these figures is about 27% of that. Further into the niche, the perspective that I'm taking from this is that competitive players who are interested in going to organized events make up about 15% of that 7%. So let's say around 200,000 people. 25% of that is non-English speakers, and about 5 to 10% of that would be Australian. So we're talking about really only between 1,000 and 5,000 people who are my potential audience. Now, this sounds small, but this is the important thing about the niche, right? We know that this audience spends a lot of time hobbying. They're painting, they're putting miniatures together, so they're consuming media content. They're watching YouTube. They're hanging out on Facebook. They're talking on Discord. They're supporting people on Patreon. They're following Instagram. They're active on Twitter. They're active on Reddit. We see Twitch streaming. So the media niche is actually quite considerable, even though there's quite a small market. So when we look at people who are in the niche and they're producing content and they're getting around 4,000 to 5,000 views, that's enormous. That's fantastic. This is an example of great audience research because it helps us expand our awareness of the cultural background of our audience, and it means we can start to challenge certain assumptions, values, histories, beliefs, and practices. For example, in the media niche that I'm interested in, there is a kind of tension between people who like to play narratively on the tabletop, and then there are people who like to play competitively, like competitive chess on the tabletop. And so there's an overlap there, but two distinctly different audience segmentations. And we need to challenge some of the assumptions that have created this difference. Another part of considering your perspective is the ethical considerations, which means that I'm in a position to speak out about things that I don't think are fair, or perhaps they are potentially problematic for the community of players and hobbyists who are my potential audience. There are questions around sponsorship and advertising, that have to be addressed and acknowledged to your audience. Sponsorship and advertising is great, but you need to be upfront about where revenue streams are coming with your audience. The qualitative research skill of perspective is vital for creating engaging, inclusive, balanced, and ethical media. By working to research the audience that you are part of and incorporate a range of perspectives in your media work, you will create media that resonates with a wider audience. The next skill we're going to focus on helps us build our perspective, and that is problematizing. When people say critical thinking or think critically, what they often mean is problematizing, which is a series of analytical processes that are often used in qualitative media ethnographic research. These processes involve identifying assumptions and the taken for granted truths, exploring a particular context to reveal hidden complexities, contradictions, and issues. Problematizing means challenging dominant narratives and perspectives. Problematizing means offering alternative viewpoints, highlighting marginalized voices, and exposing contradictions. Problematizing means asking difficult questions and breaking established norms and practices. Now, this can sometimes be challenging for your audience and challenging for you to create content in this way that is appreciated by audiences, but this is the core challenge. You can address these processes directly in your blogs this week. How did you do this? How did you problematize the content that is popular in your media niche? The important thing to remember is that you might not actually find definitive answers. Problematizing in many ways is more important to ask the difficult questions. New answers will present themselves at different times and under different conditions. Problematizing, like all of these skills, is a process that is never finished. You keep coming back to it. Problematizing ensures that you open up a space for critical dialogue with yourself and your audience, and you realize that you're never going to get to the end of that discussion. You can always achieve a deeper understanding by going through the processes of problematizing. The key is to realize that issues and symptoms are more complex than they seem, and continuing to question and examine the situation's complexities can lead to more nuanced decisions and insights. Let's apply problematizing to creating media. I've decided on my media niche, the miniatures hobby, focusing on the fantasy game Warhammer Age of Sigmar. I'm going to create podcast episodes to correspond with the weeks on content generation. So week 5, week 7, or week 10. Or I might experiment with different types of content in those weeks. The main point is this week is a podcast. My content will identify a common misconception or unaddressed issue. This is a kind of critical content that can be engaging and interesting as it challenges common assumptions and encourages people to think differently. I'm going to make problematizing the whole focus of my podcast. I'm going to call it Drop the Hammer, which is a play on the game Warhammer. And according to the Collins English Dictionary, the term drop the hammer means to legislate or crack down on certain violation or injustice. So the main section of my podcast will be focusing on critical commentary that features a flaw or a contradiction or an area of concern. This could be about the accessibility of the hobby for women or for non-English speakers or for people with disabilities, for example. So now I've got a clearer idea for the podcast content I'm going to create. Let's move on to consider engagement and discussion. So I've decided, chatting to my partner who's also interested in this hobby, we're going to record the podcast together because this will be a conversation. And we have very different views and very different perspectives about what's interesting about the hobby and what we like about it. I'm going to experiment with cameras and microphones and apps, but I'm not really worried about the quality of the output in terms of the aesthetic. This is an experiment. And at university, you're creating media content as an experiment. This is where you're going to learn these skills. So I'm not terribly worried about how it's going to turn out. We can improve it over time. And I'm not worried about audiences. I'm not worried about how many views or hits or listens or anything like that. This is to develop my skills in creating a podcast, which I've never done before. So this is going to be great. Recording the video will then assist with the content proliferation in week 6, in the following weeks. So after I create this content, next week I'm going to work on cutting it up into clips and putting it into reels and shorts on YouTube. Never done that before either. So this is going to be an experiment. The next point to consider for content generation is advocacy and change. Problematizing can be a powerful tool for advocating for change. By identifying and calling attentions to problems on a public platform, you can raise awareness about these issues and inspire your audience to take action and make changes. Part of problematizing requires research in order to make your content educational. This doesn't just mean finding out stuff about the latest product, right? It means doing background reading, looking into scholarly and academic sources about history and culture and science and general information and learning that I can bring into the media niche. For example, I've done reading about the history of the development of the miniatures war game. And we can think, politically about the idea of playing a war game on a tabletop when you're a pacifist or when you don't like the idea of war. What does that mean when you are participating in a tabletop version of it? These are questions for the podcast. I'm also interested in learning about the history of miniatures in art and culture and religions around the world and bringing that into the discussion. So I'll be doing research and reading about that and bringing it into the podcast. Next, we have the skill of approaching, which in qualitative research means effectively selecting the most suitable method for collecting and analyzing data. This skill encompasses the ability to assess the pros and cons of various data collection methods. For example, I'm not a fan of surveys, really. I don't find that they give us particular information that we can operationalize. The survey that I showed before was very general, and we're not sure about how accurate it is. I'm more of a fan of interviews and talking to content creators and talking to participants in the audience to find out directly from the person what it is that inspires them or interests them about the media niche. The point is that you have to be willing to be flexible and adaptable in acquiring and using information. While I don't like surveys that much, I have to acknowledge that survey from Goonhammer was really valuable. And also, interviews take a long time. When you're trying to transcribe them and go through the information, that's a really heavy investment in time. You also don't want to over-survey your audience. That's a potential danger. So, the first step in using the skill of approaching is to select your content themes. This means that as the content creator, you can make informed choices about the types of content that you will create. You look carefully at your media niche and see what content is already being produced. And then you think about your audience, what platforms you'll be using, what messages you want to convey, and the most effective ways of communicating it. For example, I want to encourage more people to play the competitive side of the game I'm interested in and come to events. So that's the audience that I want to talk to. So I'll be focusing on the themes of collecting, painting, playing, practicing, and preparing for those events. The second step in the skill of approaching is data collection. As we talked above, there are industry relevant sources out there that are really valuable, and you can conduct interviews. I've been talking to other content creators, and I've shown you that in another video. And in the future, I'll be able to draw on social media analytical tools, audience surveys, and my own personal survey. As I'm an audience member of this niche, so I will be looking at the trends in other people's videos, and not just the content. Like one of the examples that one of the content creators shared with me was that she took screenshots of other people's thumbnails to look at the trends of how thumbnails on YouTube were evolving over time, and making sure that her thumbnails stood out. Like, for example, there's a trend on YouTube of having your face animated in some kind of kind of pose on YouTube at the moment, and people tend to click on those. That'll change over time. So you are your best data collection method. Engaging with the audience is also part of approaching. For example, looking at the comments on the works of other content creators. How many content creators are out there commenting on comments, right? Responding to comments on YouTube. How many responses do they give? This is a time management issue. If you're getting really popular, then you're going to struggle with answering a lot of questions. Is that the point where you have a Patreon and you only respond to people on Patreon because they're paying more direct attention and financing you more directly? Or do you comment on lots of YouTube comments because that might help drive the algorithm? This is an important question to think about. The final part of approaching is continually revisiting your approach. Content creators have to be adaptable. You have to respond to new trends, new products, new interests, new issues, new tools, and constant changes to things like the recommendation algorithms of YouTube and so on. So approaching is not just at the start of content creation, but it's the part of the everyday process. Every time you sit down to start to plan out a new piece of content, you have to go through this process quite rapidly in order to produce the best and the most up-to-date content in order to compete for attention within the media niche. Okay, the final ethnographic and qualitative research skill that we will apply to media content creation is conceptualizing. This is where we distill all our observations, insights, and data into an understandable and communicatable idea or concept. This involves abstracting from specific instances to identify patterns and themes and principles to provide a deeper understanding. For example, you need to be able to have a cohesive idea about your content. The broader you are in your media niche, the less cohesive your content will be. For example, if your media niche is cosmetics, then you're in a very big pool, and the most successful cosmetic content creators will go in a couple of different ways. Some will focus on brand reviews, and that does quite well in the algorithm, but it's really bland and boring content. Really, really successful cosmetic content creators focus their content around their lifestyle, right, and their online persona. And when you go into that, you need to focus on who you are or who you are presenting, right? What is the persona you are creating? Don't try and replicate what other people are doing, but find what makes you unique, you interesting. What can you bring to this media niche that is different? For example, you could explore a specific topic or interest, such as cruelty-free or locally produced alternatives to big-name brands. More than that, you can build your content around what you stand for and how your research informs your content, becoming an expert by doing research, and not just on the web, right? But more detailed focused research into these things, drawing on academic studies. You're at university. You've got access to the library databases. You've got Google Scholar. You can bring a higher level of perspective and cohesive thematic content than other people in the niche, and that will help you stand out. It'll help you be different. The second part of conceptualizing is storytelling. Your content should have a narrative. Don't just review a brand or comment on some popular trend. Use your data and your research and your observations and structure a narrative of the experience. Good YouTube content, podcasts, even live streams have a clear beginning, middle, and end. It helps signal to your audience. You want to have your content planned out in advance so that you don't waffle or go off topic too much. I'm particularly guilty of that. You don't want to spend too much time editing, because as you get more popular, you'll have to pay for an editor or you'll do it yourself. And that can be a huge amount of time. You can take an abstract concept and talk about it, but try to provide examples and concrete metaphors even to help your audience understand and engage with the idea that you are trying to talk about. Branding. Branding is important for content creation. You want to have a font, you want to have a set of colors, you want to have a look, you want to have logos, you want to have a layout, but don't worry about that at this stage, right? This is the experimentation stage. I actually invested a lot of energy and time and money into getting a logo created for the content that I was going to create. And by the time I got around to organizing it and putting it on YouTube, someone else had already taken it. Right? So you're better off, and when this happens, don't get discouraged. Just pivot and change. We have to be flexible. We have to be adaptable. Don't let anyone discourage you about you or your content. Simply shift. Be agile. Move with it. Don't let it hold you back. Finally, we have content planning and strategy. If you're going to do a live stream, if you're going to do a podcast, if you're going to make a video, have a running sheet. Have clear talking points. Set yourself up for content proliferation by recording, taking photos, taking screenshots, having some spare kind of B-roll images, using Midjourney or other AI tools to create images. You can make some choices about logos and backgrounds and setups, but don't feel like you have anything, you don't have to have everything locked down. These will change over time and change many times as you create media. Set up a time to prepare, set up a time to record, a time to edit, and a time to upload. Book these into your calendar. Right? This is part of the professionalization of your approach. Don't create too much media to start with. Keep it short, keep it sharp, keep it simple. All right. The last thing to do this week is, well, after you've created your content, is to write up your blog post. Use the skills of perspective, problematizing, approaching, and conceptualizing to structure your post and give us an account of your content generation. I look forward to engaging with your content and seeing what you come up with. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.